We have a lot of ground to cover today, and I'm going to try to, this is going to be a lesson where we take a broad overview. We're not going to get stuck in the weeds. We're not going to get pinned down in some semantics and original language stuff so much, because we've got so much to cover. And that's why. So if you do have questions about specific things, I'll try to address them as we go forward. But there's one overarching theme, message, and point to the story that we'll be considering today that I want to really hone in and focus on. And so I do have one announcement before we go into it. As I said on Sunday, and will go out, and I think has gone out already in the Wednesday email that went out today, we will not be meeting next Wednesday. I anticipate election fatigue. Personally, I think I will feel that way, and it will be hard for me to untangle my mind from whatever is about to happen. Especially because I also think I'm going to stay up very late watching results come in until it's clear that we won't know. So we're not going to meet next week.
You may not find it on that night.
No, of course.
That's right. That's right.
That may be what happens as well. So either way, just letting you know, we're not going to be meeting next week. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll begin. Today we will be covering Genesis chapter 18, verses 16 through 33, and then chapter 19, verses 1 through 29. And I've called this lesson, The Sin of Sodom. We will be discussing what was the sin of Sodom. The story has this buildup that I think is very interesting when compared to when we compare the God we meet in this buildup to other God images that we find in the scriptures and then later in Christian theology as it would develop. It begins, then the men set out from there. That would be Abraham, Yahweh, and the two divine attendees set out from there. And they looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? He's talking to the divine attendees. Yahweh is talking to his heavenly consort. But he answers his own question. No, for I have chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Notice the Lord needs to go down and see. Very much like Yahweh walking in the garden looking for Adam and Eve. Here is a God that needs to go and investigate to see if the rumors about Sodom and Gomorrah are true. This God we meet here is a far cry from the omniscient, all-knowing God described in other places in Scripture and in Christian theology as it would develop in the centuries that followed the life of Jesus. For example, 1 John chapter 3, verse 20 reads, whenever our hearts condemn us, for God is greater than our hearts, and God knows everything. So there's an image of God that knows everything compared to this God that needs to go down and investigate and poke around and see if the rumors are true, the outcry is true. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham came near and said, will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not forgive it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find 50 righteous in the city, I will forgive the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered, let me take it upon myself to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And again he spoke, etc., etc. This basically repeats itself again and again. To cut a long story short, Abraham talks the Lord God down to 10. if 10 righteous are found in the city, then the city will be spared. And we can assume that Abraham already has in mind Lot and his family. So maybe he already has 5 or 6 righteous persons in the bag. He just needs to maybe find 4 more. Again, though, as is the case with the other material from the Yahwist source, we meet a God who is not immutable and unchanging. Here is a God that can be bargained with, a God who might change their mind. Compare and contrast this with descriptions of God in other parts of Scripture. For example, in the Torah itself, in Numbers chapter 23, verse 19, we read, God is not a human being that he should lie, or immortal that he should change his mind. What he has promised, and will he not, has he promised, and will he not do it? Has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? So you have an image of a God in Numbers that cannot change God's mind, and that's from the priestly source. You might notice the wording for God, not Lord God, not Yahweh Elohim, but simply God. So you get these different God images in the Old Testament, which you should expect with such a diverse number of voices written over so many different centuries. Before we move on, I'd like to ask a risky question. What is a Sodomite? Wait, don't answer. I think we all know how the word has been used in recent centuries. For now, let's just say that a Sodomite is anyone who commits the primary sin of Sodom, the sin that, in today's story, brought judgment and destruction down from the heavens. More on that in a minute. So the story continues in chapter 19. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. Hint, hint, this suggests that Lot has some clout. The elders of the city would sit by the gate where justice would be meted out, where new arrivals would be received. And so Lot's positioning at the entrance of the city means that he has obtained some clout. So you might ask, what would a person have to do to gain some clout and influence in a place like Sodom? And Lot presumably has done some of those things. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet so that you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. Apparently, Lot knows the nature of his home city. When they get there, he made a feast for them, baked unleavened bread, and they ate. And remember, unleavened bread is not like the bread that Abraham would make in the previous chapter. Unleavened bread is bread that you would eat in a hurry when you are about to be on your way. Later, the Israelites in the Exodus account would bake unleavened bread. We're not waiting for the dough to rise because they would be leaving Egypt in the morning. And so you get this idea that Lot knows that these divine visitors, we don't know at this point if he knows they're divine visitors or not, but he knows that they're not safe in the place that he calls home. So first he says, come inside, and then tomorrow go on your way. Spend the night, sure, and get out of here. And they want to linger in the square. And so he convinces them to come to his house. Fritham writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, the author develops this illustration in relationship to chapter 18, verses 1 through 15. That's the chapter where Abraham treats the same divine visitors by running to meet them, bowing prostrate before them, preparing a lavish meal for them, and then waiting on them hand and foot. So both chapters share the same basic thematic link, which is hospitality, which should not be narrowly conceived as if it were a matter of putting out the welcome mat. Hospitality involves a wide-ranging image, revealing fundamental relationships of well-being for individuals and society. Abraham shows hospitality in exemplary fashion. Lot follows suit to some extent, but he fails at a key juncture. The people of Sodom show no sign of what hospitality entails at all, as we will now discover. Verse 4 of chapter 19, but before they lay down, the men of the city and the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, and they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Yes, know them means what you think it does. The men of the city want to gang rape the divine visitors. This detail is where people fixate. The sin of Sodom, conventional assumptions assert, is the same-sex nature of this assault. Such an interpretation does not take into account the history and the nature of sexual humiliation, something that still occurs today and has gone on through the centuries. So Lowry writes in the Chalice Guide to the Old Testament, a mob gathers and threatens to gang rape the travelers, a violent act of humiliation associated with warfare. Defeated enemies often were raped. By treating the travelers as conquered enemies, Sodom confirms its reputation for injustice. By declaring war on the vulnerable, the men of Sodom inadvertently declare war on Yahweh and bring destruction on themselves. A 2009 study by Laura Stemple, which I've included the link to in the sources cited page that I will leave up for a few seconds after we're done with this presentation. But in a 2009 study, Laura Stemple found that it had been documented in conflicts worldwide, for example, that 76% of male political prisoners in the 1980s in El Salvador and 80% of concentration camp inmates in Sarajevo reported being raped or sexually tortured. In 2004, the American public were scandalized to discover the sexual abuse and torment of Iraqi prisoners by American soldiers at Abu Ghraib. The abuse was depraved and descriptions of it are graphic. They include videotaping and photographing naked male and female detainees, forcibly arranging detainees in various sexually explicit positions for photographing, forcing detainees to remove their clothing and keeping them naked for several days at a time, forcing naked male detainees to wear women's underwear, forcing groups of male detainees to masturbate themselves while being photographed and videotaped, arranging naked male detainees in a pile and then jumping on them. I bring this up, all of this graphic stuff up, in the context of a story where the men of this city, Sodom, want to gang rape these angelic visitors, to point out that sexual humiliation in instances like these is not about sexual orientation. It is about humiliation and degradation. In times of war, people who would consider themselves heterosexual do these things, as bloodlust calls these very evil, wicked energies from them. This is well documented, and this is what is happening here in the city of Sodom. Hybert writes, here is the type of sex, violent sex, rape that demeans and humiliates its male victims. The townsmen see this abuse as a way to harm and eliminate outsiders. This story therefore specifically criticizes rape, whether it is against men, Lot's visitors, or against women, Lot's daughters, as we'll read here in a second. Such behavior is utterly opposed to the sacred duty to be hospitable. The story's earliest interpreters focus on the townsmen's harsh treatment of outsiders rather than on the sexual activity by which they meant to cause harm. The point, focusing on the same-sex nature of the men of Sodom's request completely misses the point. This passage does nothing to inform our modern discussions about the inclusion of LGBTQ persons and their full inclusion into our societies and religious communities. The sin of Sodom was not that they indulged in sexual acts with persons of the same sex. So what was the sin of Sodom? More on that in a bit. Verse 6. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. Notice, Lot's focus is set on the fact that the men of Sodom are wanting to infringe on the hospitality shown to Lot's guests, who are under the shelter of his roof. In offering up his daughters, Lot is trying to grasp at the remnants of what's left of his image as a gracious host. Here we return to a theme that is regrettably all too common. Women treated as property and pawns, disposable. Here they are offered as persons more fitting to rape than Lot's house guests. Hybert writes, the storyteller likely views Lot's offer of his daughters as the desperate act of a father fiercely committed to ancient standards of hospitality. Lot's action also reveals the dangerous place of women as second-class citizens in a male-dominated world and the violence they could experience there. Verse 9 going on, but they replied, stand back. And they said, this fellow came here as an alien, referring to Lot, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. So note, in verse 9, Lot is now lumped in with the foreigners. He is being identified as an outsider and therefore unworthy of mercy. Lot refers to the men out his front door as brothers. This is a term of endearment, and they are casting him on the outside of their in-group. And they say they're going to do worse to him than what they had planned for the other foreign guests, the divine visitors. So this emphasizes the themes evident in this passage of us versus them, true citizen versus alien, insider versus outsider. And it's becoming increasingly evident that this is a culture, a civilization, that only cares for its own to the neglect of the outsider. But it is not enough to neglect the outsider. The outsider must be consumed. The divine agents, the angels, intervene, providing protection for Lot and his house. Verse 12. Then the men said to Lot, have you anyone else here? The men being the angels. Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone that you have in the city, bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. Here we have one final overture of grace. Lot and his house will be saved, as he has shown some effort towards hospitality, although his attempt stands in stark contrast with Abraham's hospitality, as read about in Genesis 18. Lot is given an opportunity to extend the invitation to his would-be sons-in-law, and they do not take the warning seriously. One is reminded here of prophetic voices in times and places where the ears of the people are stopped up and the hearts are hard, unwilling to receive the hard news that their ways are destructive ways. You might think of the way John the Baptist's voice was received in Jesus' day, or the way that the prophets' voices were received, or the way that Noah's voice was received when he warned the people of the impending doom. When morning dawned, verse 15, the angels urged Lot, saying, get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand. You have to have this image in your head. He's not wanting to leave, and he's basically being dragged out of the city. It goes on, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city, saving him in spite of himself, I would add. When they had brought them outside, they said, flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed. And Lot said to them, oh no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, for fear the disaster will overtake me, and I die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved. He said to him, very well, I grant you this favor too, and will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive there. Therefore the city was called Zoar, and the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. So verse 16, Lot lingered. We see a similar impulse manifest in his wife in a little bit. Why would he linger in the city and in the culture that just before was set to rape his guests, his daughters, and then to do worse to him? It shows the insidious nature of cultures that are death-dealing, but yet captivate you at the same time. Lot's impulse is in keeping with our own human tendency to stay with what is familiar and to overlook an abundance of evil and death-dealing ways to maintain order and to avoid chaos. In a similar way, Germans tolerated the mistreatment of Jews and other ethnic minorities. In a similar way, we live with the mistreatment of marginalized persons in our own time and in our own place. Lot cannot muster up the courage or the faith to follow the directions of the angels. He has to be dragged out of the city, and then he is to flee to the hills. In other words, he is to completely cut himself and his family off from the ways and the patterns of Sodom. Just clean break. And this prospect terrifies Lot, so he strikes a compromise with the angels. Zor means little. It literally means little. So all of this talk about Lot saying, this is a little city down there. Is that okay? A little city. So apparently it too was a city set aside for destruction, but Lot's willingness to inhabit that city spares it. So one wonders if the balance between righteous inhabitants and wicked inhabitants that drove Abraham's discussion in the back half of chapter 18 might be found in Zoar, where there are presumably fewer wicked persons. We don't know. It's just a interesting line of thought. If that's what we're supposed to be thinking. Verse 24, and here it comes. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Handel writes, though Lot is a buffoon, his wife is even worse off, for she cannot resist a peek at the city's destruction in spite of the angel's command not to look back. For this tragic flaw, she becomes a part of the landscape of the Dead Sea region, a pillar of salt. Hybert writes, salt deposits around the Dead Sea can take the form of pillars, some with lifelike shapes, which provides the source for this familiar detail about Lot's wife. And I'll even add, when I went to Israel and visited the Dead Sea, you can see these columns of salt that dot the landscape. The point seems to be, leave the death-dealing ways of violence and oppression behind you. Don't even look back. Then the story concludes abruptly. Verse 27, Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain and saw all the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. And then verse 29, so it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. That last bit might sound a bit disjointed, and if you picked up on that, that's good. We're recognizing that is from a different source. That last line is the priestly source's very, very brief account of these events. So some takeaways. Many Jews and Christians, and I guess I should just say humans generally speaking these days, are uneasy, if not outright appalled, at such depictions of divine retribution and judgment. Full disclosure, I number among those who are appalled at these depictions of divine retribution and judgment. I'm reminded of the story of Noah and the flood, when the judgment is meted out on everyone, children, animals, the innocent. You must wonder, why is that necessary? And as is the case when considering the flood stories, we miss the forest for the trees when we choose to consider these stories as history or to take them so literally. This story does not have to have happened in history for us to understand what human behavior is condemned in this text. In fact, we do not know where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were located. Traditionally, they are thought to have been near or beneath the waters of the Dead Sea. Here is a location that is desolate, where nothing grows. Perhaps such stories about this desolate place fueled the theological discussions about what could cause such a wasteland. What patterns of human living lead to such deadly places? And at this moment, I'm calling to mind our discussion about the Garden of Eden, how geographically it's impossible, if you actually take the landmarks that are described there in the rivers, to suggest that this is no place. This is more of an idyllic idea, and perhaps Sodom and Gomorrah are the inverse of that. The place that is the absolute antithesis of what is meant for healthy human society to look like. Which leads us to the question that I asked partway through this lesson: what is the sin of Sodom? What is sodomy? And who are the Sodomites? Turns out the question is answered in the Bible itself. So modern readers have reduced the sin of sodomy to same-sex sexual acts between men. This has been our fixation, largely stemming from homophobia, I might add. And this, I have to say, this is not the understanding of the readers in biblical times. So what was their understanding? Fortunately, this answer is fairly easy to ascertain. Just read the Bible. The sin of Sodom in scriptures is as follows, and this is first reading is from Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 48 through 49. The prophet writes, "As I live, says the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. So here it comes. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. There it is. That is the sin of Sodom. And Jesus would say the same thing in Matthew chapter 10, and this story is also repeated in the Gospel of Luke, but this is right after he's giving instructions or during giving instructions to his disciples about how to go through the countryside and to find hospitable houses to inhabit whilst they are spreading the good news of the coming of the realm of God. And he says, whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, take your peace, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. So themes again of hospitality. So who are the real Sodomites? Sodomite redefined. Anyone who does not welcome the foreigner or treat the outsider with respect. A Sodomite in the biblical sense of the word is anyone who, to repeat again the words of the prophet Ezekiel, has pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but does not aid the poor and the needy. For centuries, the word sodomite has been used to demean and dehumanize gay persons, most specifically gay men, when in fact, the real sodomites have been those who, through the centuries, have failed to treat strangers and outsiders well, who have failed to follow the example of Abraham we read about in Genesis 18, 1 through 15, where he ran out to greet his guests in the heat of the day, fed them lavishly, and waited on them hand and foot, not knowing he was entertaining angels. The ways of Sodom and Gomorrah are still practiced today. Foreign persons are met with violence instead of peace. Children have been separated from their parents at our southern border. And as of this week, more than 500 children remain apart from their parents. Accents and other languages are heard with apprehension and suspicious ears. Pride, greed, and prosperous ease still stand as obstacles to generosity, to aid for the poor and the needy. Sometimes our ways and Sodom's ways are not so different. Fortunately, we too are offered opportunities to repent and change our ways. We can welcome the prophetic voice into our midst and fundamentally change the way that we treat those of different countries, cultures, or religions. If we do not, ours is the fate of Sodom. For societies that are inward focused, to the neglect of the stranger and the neighbor, consume themselves, collapse, and die. If you want another example of that, read the book of Revelation, which is about the Roman Empire doing just that. Moment to look at the sources, and if you're taking notes, Laura Stemple is the study of male rape and human rights that I cited earlier, but I can email this PowerPoint presentation to any who might be interested. And now I am bringing us back for discussion. Don't all go.
I'll jump in. In the discussion, which in defining the sodomite and the abuse of people and everything, I was reminded of what some in the American Asian community are having to deal with in response to Trump's continued use of China virus. And in my estimate, people are stupid enough to use this as a club.
We call it the Spanish flu. That was named Spanish flu because in that time Spain was the only country you could really criticize in the context of World War I because they hadn't joined the fray. and they weren't participating in World War I, and so it was politically harmful to castigate your allies. And the first place it was noticed was in the front lines of World War I, and where soldiers were getting sick and were dying. And so the Spaniards were blamed for it, and it got branded the Spanish flu. When, as the years would go by, it was traced to a chicken farm in Kansas. That's where it originated. And so I wonder how the Kansans would feel if today we were calling it the Kansas flu, and somehow somehow suggesting that people from Kansas were especially dirty or at fault or to blame, or somehow deficient culturally, or that their local governments were our adversaries, which is how it functions when you brand what should be a neutral name. COVID-19 is very helpful. It's not a person or a culture or an identity. It is just a germ. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry for Janet's probable frustration that she's not Chinese, but Asiatic people get lumped into a big category, and that's also a problem. And
Absolutely.
I have a friend I went to seminary with who has had relatives verbally accosted in throughout the course of the summer because they're Japanese descent, but who has the time to make those distinctions these days? Some people,
Right.
think.
Yeah. The American Psychiatric Association, somebody associated with them, created a hotline for people to call in with different events, anything verbal, physical, psychological. And this was back in April. They had tabulated, hundreds of different incidents of assault, Asian Americans. And it didn't matter, what your background was. They were all getting it. And I am very afraid for my niece by marriage, who is Chinese. And she and my nephew have twin boys who are 2, and they live right there in Indiana. And my brother says, "Oh no, that's not going on." But I wonder. He really wants things to be fine, but it is concerning to me. And every time I hear those words, Larry, come out of the mouth, I do get concerned. You probably hear it a lot more. It's more of a population where you're living right now than in central Indiana, but still, that fear of the foreigner, the visitor, whatever you think they are, the people who don't belong here, that mentality kind of sets in, and we forget how much we are all visitors here, to this land.
Well, what I hope to do, and it's not some work of scholarly gymnastics. I didn't have to work very hard to do this. It's the way we're supposed to actually understand this story, is to have a tale of two instances of hospitality, or a failure to be hospitable, where you have Abraham as the archetype and the father of the faith, who greets these angelic visitors, and Yahweh themselves, the deity, doesn't know it, but still, in the heat of the day, at the most inconvenient time and most unlikely time, treats the guests with, just over and above, but also expected hospitality. And then you go have two of those same visitors, the 2 angelic beings, leave Yahweh. We don't know where Yahweh maybe goes to Gomorrah. We're supposed to think we don't know. Go to the nephew of that one, whose focus seems to be, how do I navigate this culture and this different climate that has very different values, that treats these visitors not as honored guests, but with suspicion, and then wants to degrade them and dehumanize them in the most graphic, appalling ways. And these are to be held up together on purpose to see that the ways of Sodom lead to the societal collapse, where there is no compassion, where there is no love. Where that finds you, where that leads you to, is societal collapse, an inability to live well together as the members of that culture consume one another one way or another, whether it's the economy that grinds them down through brute labor, or whether they actually are killed in some form of ethnic cleansing, which does happen, or whether they are rounded up and arrested, as were the Japanese in our country during the 40s. Wherever there is a loss of love and a lack of compassion and care for the outsider, the one on the fringe, the one who isn't readily identifiable as your in group, the society collapses. And that's the point. And that's what brings the apocalyptic judgment down, the divine judgment down in this way. And then the people, as they told the story in centuries to follow, would be adjacent to the Dead Sea, which is just, maybe 15 miles, I think, south of the Sea of Galilee, where you have this contrast of very lush and beautiful space with this dead space. And you say, what leads to this kind of death, where even in the water, nothing grows? It's good for nothing. And the answer is, when you have an abundance and you fail to care for the poor and the needy. That's the sin of Sodom. That is sodomy. Now, I don't think we're going to reclaim the word. I think it's been pulled so thoroughly into a very specific sexual act, and that people through them started in the Middle Ages, really, and people became fixated with that as the primary thrust of the story, which has really neutered it of its power and its punch and its applicability. But it is the point. And that was the biblical understanding in the biblical world. That's why I read from Ezekiel. And when Jesus brings up the story and names what the sin of Sodom was, he brings it up in the context of his disciples not being treated hospitably when they visit a community to bring in the good news of the realm of God, much like the angels visited Sodom, bearing with them the presence of, in the name of Yahweh, in the name of the judge of all earth and the creator. Same sort of thing. So you are also, I don't know what you're thinking.
I think it's a real warning to us. I mean, God's patience can only go so far. And although we don't see these kind of events today, but in the end time, it'll be there.
It's easy to conceive as we're talking about forest fires out west and hurricane barreling down on Louisiana. Connie, I hope your son is okay.
I haven't heard from him, but I'm hoping so too.
It's easy to the question of when you're dealing with prophetic literature like the book of Revelation is whether you really need a divine agency for it all to collapse. And this was the case with Rome. The metaphor pulling straight from the plague accounts in Exodus, in its own unique way, came alive in real time as the Roman Empire would fold in on itself, and for the same reasons. If you read, we get to Revelation someday, way at this pace when I'm 58.
That was a quick calculation.
I don't know how long. I don't really know how long it'll take. But then we might not. We probably won't go through the Bible linearly to start to end. But we'll talk more about that.
It's funny, when the fires first started and I was praying for them to cease, I would pray for rain, and I would pray for the wind to be a gentle breeze. And for some reason at that time, and the fires though have been going on for months now, and I would say, Lord, if there are 10, will you save them? And I don't know why I thought about that, but I did. There's so much. 2 more firefighters now that are fighting for their lives, and people's homes are just gone. It makes you wonder. When Katrina came, someone said, well, that's because that was a city of sin and God destroyed it. And I'm not going to say that California is a state of sin. I'm going to say they have a different lifestyle than the Midwest. Things start in California and expand out through the US. And their lifestyle is certainly different than those in the Midwest. We spent a year in California when John was in the military. And even then, we saw differences in the way they lived. So
Is an interesting point since you brought up Katrina. The red light district in Bourbon Street were amongst the areas that were relatively untouched by the floodwaters.
No floodwaters, totally dry. Yeah.
So I'm saying, like, if it's
I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that's what I've heard. And
Pat Robertson said that, and has hardly lived it down, because it's like, all right, so God's gonna punish the city, but the aim is a little off. Like you're gonna
I mean,
instead you're gonna flood out like the poorest,
the poorest,
subsidized housing.
the absolute poorest were hit the hardest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it does.
Yeah.
I think,
and I don't believe that the fires in Colorado are because of our lifestyle. I mean, it's hitting some of the most beautiful, pristine areas of the state. I mean, I just cry when you say that, Sue. I don't believe it has anything to do with the lifestyle of the people who live here.
I don't believe it either. I'm just saying I was comparing it to the Katrina, the way some people thought about Katrina, that people are thinking about California in the same fashion. And
I have heard people voice that.
yeah.
I don't believe it, but I've heard people voice it.
Yeah.
Well, people are looking for something to blame, something, someone,
Right.
some group, some whatever. That somebody has to be to blame for it.
Right.
Yeah.
And they think it's a God thing. I mean, I don't know whether this is right or not, but in my understanding, when God created the world, he created it with rules for the environment and the weather. And if you have a cold front and a warm front come together, it's my understanding you're going to have some sort of weather. And I think that's the way it is, when tornadoes hit one state and not another state. We had a tornado come through our area, and in the next block or two south, the tornado came down and took the roofs off the houses, but yet he spared our house. So it's just rules that God put in place, and when things happen, they happen. If you have dry ground, and for some reason someone decides to send off a baby announcement, and it explodes and starts a fire, it's not God. Those people who were stupid enough to mess with fire and dry ground.
But we're also meant to be stewards of the earth, and we have not been good stewards of the earth.
Amen.
And so, for years now, the gas and oil companies have known that what they're feeding to us and saying is a good thing, that we become dependent on them for our energy source, is producing carbon emissions that are heating up the earth beyond a point, our capacity to recover. And that's our fault. That's human made.
Yeah.
And we have a responsibility to keep an eye on that, to make sure that the earth is going to be okay. I mean, that's our responsibility. And, you know, the NOAA and NASA have data on this. That's science. And science is something that I believe goes hand in hand with what God wants us to use. I mean, this is a tool God gave us. I mean, I used to tell my patients, you know, there's God in Prozac. If we use it properly, you know, you can get well using a pill. It doesn't have to be prayer or Prozac. It can be both, you know, because God gave us these wonderful minds and the ability to use science. And if we apply it properly, it can help us. You know, it's kind of like the vaccines that we're making for COVID or the remdesivir or whatever else it is. You know, God gave us these wonderful capabilities. And if we apply them properly, He's using us divinely to help each other. And by golly, it's time for us to help the earth and not just say, oh, well, you know, these fires are because we're wicked. No, they're not. We did this. And we've got to get ourselves out of this. Our children, I mean, my child doesn't even want to have children at this point because the earth is maybe not going to recover. What air is there going to be left to breathe? I mean, I don't know. I just hurt for everything that's going on right now, but we can take care of it if we take charge. I don't think we're being, you know, very good citizens of the earth. And we're not also, I mean, that's a whole other subject. I'm sorry, but I'm just
I think
getting
right now, we do what we can for the earth, but in reality, it's not the individual, it's businesses and government that'll make the final decisions. So we can do what we can. We can vote for those people who promise to do those things and may or may not do them, but we don't know. But we do what we can to save the earth.
well, we're
But
Absolutely.
God's not going to destroy the earth. I mean, we hear in Revelations, you know, third of the earth's going to be destroyed at one time, and the third of the sea is going to be destroyed. But that's for God to take care of then, not now.
Well,
All
I
sins are visited on us. So, okay, preach, Judith, preach.
yeah. Yeah.